The 19th of June 1312. The sound of an axe cutting through the air echoes across Blacklow Hill in Warwickshire. The blade meets the neck of a kneeling man, separating his head from his body in a single precise blow. Blood spreads across the English grass as the executioners retreat in silence. Thus ends the life of Piers Gaveston, the man who rose higher than any royal favorite in England's history, and fell even more spectacularly. But who was this man who truly conquered a king's heart and awakened the hatred of an entire nation? How did a young Gascon manage to dominate the mind of Europe's most powerful monarch? And why was his death necessary to save the very kingdom from ruin? To understand this story of love, power, and betrayal, we must return to the golden palaces of medieval England. Edward, Prince of Wales, was everything a future king should not have been. Tall, blonde, and physically imposing, he possessed the appearance of a medieval warrior, but his heart was far from the battlefields. While his father, Edward I, conquered Scotland with an iron fist, the young prince preferred the company of musicians, artists, and especially a dark-tailed Gascon knight with a seductive smile, named Piers Gaveston. Gaveston arrived at the English court as the son of a minor knight from Gascony, a region that belonged to the English crown. Intelligent, witty, and gifted with irresistible charm, he quickly became the prince's inseparable companion. Together they hunted, participated in tournaments, and spent entire nights discussing poetry and music passions that scandalized the English barons accustomed to warrior princes. Contemporary accounts, such as the Vita Edwardi Secundi, describe Gaveston as a skilled jouster, outshining many nobles in tournaments, which only fueled their resentment toward the upstart Gascon. The relationship between Edward and Piers was intense and exclusive. The prince dispensed with centuries-old protocols to be with his favorite, ignored advice from experienced ministers to follow Gaveston's opinions, and, more seriously still, began distributing riches and lands to this foreigner, as if they were breadcrumbs. Royal household records from 1307 show Gaveston receiving generous grants, including cash payments and robes, far exceeding those given to other courtiers, signaling Edward's favoritism early on. Edward I observed this situation with growing alarm. In 1307, the king made a drastic decision. He exiled Piers Gaveston from England. Chronicles like the Annals Paulini note that Edward I's decision stemmed from fears that Gaveston's influence was undermining the prince's preparation for kingship, with some courtiers alleging improper closeness. This separation was devastating for the prince, who begged on his knees for his favorite's pardon, but Edward I remained unmoved. Gaveston departed for France, leaving an insoluble prince and a court finally at peace. However, the relief was short-lived. In July 1307, Edward I died during a campaign in Scotland, and his son ascended the throne as Edward II. The new king's first action was to revoke Piers Gaveston's exile. His second was something even more scandalous. He granted him the title of Earl of Cornwall, one of England's richest counties, traditionally reserved for members of the royal family. The charter granting the earldom, preserved in the National Archives, was issued on August 6, 1307, just weeks after Edward II's accession, highlighting his urgency to elevate Gaveston. Gaveston's return transformed the English court into a political battlefield. The new earl not only recovered his privileged position, he expanded it beyond any historical precedent. Edward II treated him as an equal, or even as a superior, consulting him on all important decisions, and completely ignoring the advice of the English barons. The public displays of affection between the king and his favorite shocked a medieval society, rigid in its codes of behavior. Gaveston sat beside the throne during official ceremonies, wore the crown jewels at banquets, and received gifts that rivaled the dowries of princesses. More disturbing still, Edward seemed incapable of making any decision without Piers's approval. The Flores Historiarum records that Gaveston's prominence at Edward's coronation in 1308, where he carried the crown, provoked outrage among nobles, with some calling him a second king. The English barons, proud men who had faithfully served Edward I, found themselves marginalized by a foreigner they considered unworthy. Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and one of the realm's most powerful men, led the growing opposition. For these nobles, Gaveston was not merely an inconvenient favorite. He was an existential threat to the established order. The situation deteriorated rapidly when Gaveston began openly demonstrating his contempt for the English barons. He created insulting nicknames for them. Thomas of Lancaster became the actor due to his tendency for dramatic speeches. Guy of Warwick became the Black Dog of Arden. These insults, pronounced aloud during royal banquets, publicly humiliated men accustomed to respect and deference. The Chronicle of Lanercost notes Gaveston's mocking nicknames, which were recited in court to the delight of Edward and the fury of the insulted earls. More seriously still, rumors began circulating about the true nature of the relationship between Edward and Gaveston. Chroniclers of the time wrote about improper love and unspeakable vices. Although concrete proof of a sexual relationship never existed, the insinuations were sufficient to scandalize a deeply religious society that considered sodomy a mortal sin. The Vita Edwardi Secundi hints at such rumors, stating that Edward's immoderate love for Gaveston led to accusations of moral corruption, though it avoids explicit details. In 1308, the pressure from the barons became unbearable. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, they threatened open rebellion if Gaveston were not exiled again. Edward II, still young in his reign and without sufficient military support, was forced to yield. Piers Gaveston was appointed Payton of Ireland, technically a promotion, but in practice a gilded exile. The separation was again painful for Edward, but Gaveston proved adaptable. In Ireland, he demonstrated considerable administrative competence, organizing local finances, and even conducting successful military campaigns against Irish rebels. Irish annals from 1st Re. 081309, such as the Annals of Innisfallen, credit Gaveston with strengthening English defenses in Dublin, showing his capability when given real authority. For some months, it seemed the problem was resolved. Gaveston was occupied with real responsibilities, and the English barons could finally influence the king's decisions. But Edward II was incapable of living without his favorite. The letters they exchanged during this period revealed the intensity of his longing. The king wrote about the emptiness in my heart, and promised to move heaven and earth to reunite with Pierre. Surviving correspondence in the National Archives includes Edward's letters to Gaveston, filled with emotional pleas and promises of rewards, underscoring their deep bond. In 1309, only 1 year after the second exile, Edward found an excuse to bring him back. His marriage to Isabella of France required the presence of all the realm's great men. The 25th of January 1308, Notre Dame Cathedral in Boulogne gleamed with hundreds of candles as Edward II of England married Isabella, daughter of Philip I of France. It was a crucial political alliance designed to strengthen peace between Europe's two most powerful kingdoms. But what should have been a moment of diplomatic triumph became a source of scandal and humiliation. Edward arrived in France accompanied by Piers Gaveston, who displayed jewels and clothing more luxurious than the king himself wore. During the ceremony, French guests observed in shock how the English monarch paid more attention to his favorite than to his own bride. Worse still, many of the jewels Gaveston displayed had been wedding gifts intended for the new queen. Edward had given them to his favorite before the ceremony even took place. French chroniclers such as Jean de Saint-Victor report that Isabella's uncles left the coronation banquet early, insulted by Edward's preference for Gaveston over their niece. Isabella of France, only 12 years old but already politically astute, immediately understood her precarious position. Daughter of one of Europe's most powerful kings, she had been educated to be an influential queen, but found herself marginalized at her own wedding. The humiliations continued during the honeymoon. Edward spent more time with Gaveston than with his wife, and the favorite received gifts and honors that should have been hers. Thomas of Lancaster was no longer willing to tolerate the situation. A man of explosive temperament, but gifted with considerable political skill, he began articulating a coalition of barons united only by their common hatred of Piers Gaveston, Guy of Warwick, Aymer de Valence, Henry de Lacy. One by one, the great names of English nobility joined the conspiracy. Their plan was ingenious. They would force the king to accept a document known as the Ordinances, which would drastically limit royal power and, crucially, require Gaveston's permanent exile. If Edward refused, he would face a civil war. He would probably lose. If he accepted, he would lose his favorite forever, but keep his throne. The Statute of Stamford 1309 shows early baronial efforts to curb Edward's favoritism, laying the groundwork for the more aggressive ordinances of 1311. In 1311, the barons marched on London with an army. Edward II, surprised by the rebels' speed and determination, realized he had no choice. In October, he signed the ordinances, accepting humiliating limitations on his royal power. Piers Gaveston was exiled again, this time under penalty of death, should he return to England. But Edward and Gaveston were masters at finding legal loopholes. The favorite went to Flanders, technically fulfilling his exile, but maintained constant correspondence with the king. Worse still, Edward secretly began gathering military support, promising lands and titles to knights willing to fight for. Financial accounts from 1311 reveal Edward funneling funds to loyalists in the north, preparing for Gaveston's return and a potential conflict. The kingdom was walking inexorably toward civil war. At Christmas 1311, Piers Gaveston was back in England. Edward had declared the ordinances invalid and restored all his favorites' titles. For the barons, this was a declaration of war. Thomas of Lancaster sent ultimatums to the king. Gaveston must leave immediately, or face the consequences. Edward, however, had learned from previous mistakes. This time he prepared to fight. He moved the court north, away from London, and began recruiting mercenaries. Gaveston was sent to Scarborough Castle, a fortress considered impregnable, on the Yorkshire coast. The plan was to resist until reinforcements arrived from Scotland and Ireland. But the rebel barons moved with surprising speed. In May 1312, Guy of Warwick besieged Scarborough with a well-equipped army. The castle, though strong, had not been supplied for a prolonged siege. After only a few weeks, the situation became desperate. Piers Gaveston, demonstrating physical courage that his enemies reluctantly acknowledged, decided to negotiate directly with the besiegers. He met with Guy of Warwick and Aymer de Valence, who offered him surprisingly generous terms. He would be treated as a prisoner of honor until an assembly of peers decided his fate. Without alternatives, Gaveston accepted. The Annales Londiniennes describe Gaveston's surrender on May 19, 1312, noting the baron's promise of safe conduct, which was soon violated. What happened next remains one of the most infamous betrayals in medieval English history. Aymer de Valence, who had given his word of honor to protect Gaveston, escorted the prisoner to Dedenton in Oxfordshire. There, during the night, Thomas of Lancaster arrived with a group of armed knights. Valence was conveniently awakened by a false alarm and left the castle, allowing Lancaster to capture Gaveston without resistance. For Lancaster and his allies, the moment for final revenge had arrived. Piers Gaveston had humiliated the English nobility, corrupted the king, and threatened the kingdom's stability. No trial would be necessary. His guilt was evident to all. The Chronicle of Lanarcost recounts that Lancaster and Warwick held a cursory trial at Warwick Castle, attended by Earls Hereford and Arundel. But Gaveston was denied any chance to defend himself. On the 19th of June 1312, they took him to Blacklow Hill, a somber hill that belonged to Guy of Warwick. The execution site was not chosen by chance. Blacklow Hill was situated on Warwick's lands, allowing Guy to fulfill a promise he had made publicly. Gaveston would die on his properties. 2 Welsh knights known for their skill with the sword were chosen as executioners. The royal favorite faced death with dignity, kneeling calmly while saying God. The axe fell only once. Piers Gaveston's head rolled down the slope while his blood mixed with English soil. Thus ended the life of the man who had been, for almost a decade, the most powerful person in England after the king himself. The Vita Edwardia Didi notes that Gaveston's body was left on the hill until Dominican friars retrieved it, sewing the head back on for transport to Oxford, as his excommunication prevented immediate burial. Gaveston's death did not bring peace to England. On the contrary, it plunged the realm into years of civil war. Edward II never forgave his favorite's murderers, and spent the rest of his reign trying to avenge them. Thomas of Lancaster, the conspiracy's principal architect, manorial records from Pontefract Castle confirm Lancaster's execution on March 22, 1322, as Edward's revenge for Gaveston's death. Ironically, Edward II himself would meet no less terrible a fate. In 1327, he was deposed by his wife Isabella, the same French princess who had been humiliated during her wedding due to her husband's obsession with Gaveston. Edward was brutally murdered at Berkeley Castle, supposedly with a red-hot poker inserted into his bowels. While the poker story, recorded in later chronicles like Froissart's, is likely exaggerated, Berkeley Castle's accounts confirm Edward's imprisonment and death in September 1327. But the question that most intrigues modern historians is whether Piers Gaveston was truly the greedy villain painted by medieval chronicles. Chroniclers of the time described him as obsessed with gold and jewels, accumulating treasures that rivaled those of the crown itself. However, surviving financial records suggest a more complex reality. Although he did indeed receive valuable lands and titles, much of his wealth consisted of rents and properties that would revert to the crown after his death. Exactly what happened. Exchequer rolls from 1st Re. 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 5 show that Gaveston's estates, including Cornwall, were reabsorbed by the crown, contradicting claims of permanent enrichment. This discrepancy between contemporary perception and historical records raises disturbing questions about how history is written by the victors. The chroniclers who described Gaveston as a greedy parasite were frequently connected to the same barons who conspired against him. Their descriptions may have been deliberately exaggerated to justify the murder of a man who technically was never tried for any crime. J.S. Hamilton's Piers Gaveston, Earl of Cornwall, 1988, argues that Gaveston's wealth was largely tied to royal patronage, not personal greed, and his downfall was driven by political rivalry rather than moral failings. Today, more than 700 years later, the figure of Piers Gaveston continues to defy simple categorization. Was he an unscrupulous opportunist who exploited a king's love, or a victim of xenophobia and aristocratic envy? The truth, as often happens in history, probably lies somewhere between these extremes. What remains indisputable is that Piers Gaveston paid the supreme price for daring to dream beyond his social position, for conquering a king's heart, and for challenging an established order that did not tolerate intruders. The king's lover, who was beheaded as a traitor, left a legacy that transcends his violent death, an eternal lesson about ambition, love, and the terrible price both can demand when practiced at the vertiginous heights of absolute power.